I store apples in my garden summer house in Oxford, and just recently I noticed they'd all been nibbled. When I stalked up to the window, I found a party of wood mice having a feast. Now these lovely little creatures have crept in from the countryside into my town garden, and I began to wonder about the way in which wildlife colonizes our cities. You know, it's not only the wood mice that we've got in my summer house, we've also got foxes that come into the garden under holes in the fence or by hopping over the top. We've got grey squirrels, hedgehogs, blackbirds, magpies. We've even got a kestrel, and of course the frogs and newts in our pond. And if we add to those the butterflies and the myriads of other insects that we've got here, altogether we must have hundreds of species. Now, of course, all these animals have arrived here from the countryside. Now today, an awful lot of people will say this is because animals are adapting to life in the town, almost as if they changed their very nature. But I don't really believe that's true, because for most animals, their behaviour is more or less fixed. But there is, in fact, another way of looking at the way in which wildlife colonises our cities. Think of this as an island in a hostile sea of concrete and traffic. And of course, any animals that are going to reach this patch are going to have to get here from the countryside. What we really want to know is why is it that some creatures are successful in colonizing these islands and others are not? You can take any of these patches you like, whether it's this garden or it's a large park. Now, strangely enough, one of the best studied of these islands is right in the centre of London. Now, the centre of a great city isn't much of a place for most wildlife, and you couldn't find a more hostile environment than outside Buckingham Palace. House sparrows do nest in the palace gates, and there's even a starling brood in the mouth of a stone lion. But take a look behind the palace, and it's a different world. Here we are in the 39 acres of Her Majesty's back garden, which is much bigger than mine and is quite an amazing nature reserve. The reason we know so much about what wildlife can be found here is that it's actually been studied over 20 years by a team of naturalists. They were led by a wonderful character, botanist David McClintock.
Fred, come and look at all this.
Who got help from the palace gardeners.
The survey, in fact, lasted for 5 years in the early 1960s. And in that time, we found 260 different plants, wild or naturalized. And since those days, I've added nearly another 50 since, because I still have the privilege of coming in, and it is a wonderful privilege, and I keep close watch on what comes in this garden. And I'm thrilled to find new plants. And practically every time I come in, I find a new one's arrived.
What we got
Well,
here.
Fred, look at this.
Yeah.
Now, this is quite a discovery.
That's new, surely.
I don't think I've seen this in the palace grounds before. This is a chervil of sorts.
Yeah.
And you can eat this too if you
Yeah.
want to. There. It's good. There's a white campion coming on.
Yeah.
That'll be a nice big white flower.
Yeah.
And look at all the hemlock water droplet.
It's very enormously, isn't it?
Oh, look at the daisies, Fred.
Daisies, yeah.
Now, the wild plants have got here in all sorts of ways. Many, like the yellow Oxford ragwort, have wind-blown seeds. Others have got in potting plants or clinging to the clothes of visitors to garden parties.
Well, these are oxeye daisies. Some people call them marguerites. And in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, they'll be an absolute blaze of colour, large, white, 2-inch daisies.
And there's one amazing find here that mystifies me and David McClintock.
Well, here's one of the great specialities and surprises of this garden. It's the adder's tongue fern. You mightn't think it's a fern, but it's related to the ferns. And when it's fully out, all this will be yellow. It's a lovely sight. And it's quite amazing to find it here because it's normally a constituent of old meadowland. And we only found it here about 3 or 4 years ago. But how it got here is anybody's guess.
When we begin to think about the kinds of species that do well here, a pattern emerges. Spiders do well because they can easily travel across town. Some spin silk threads which carry them on the breeze. There are hundreds of insects, like this damselfly. And feeding on insects, you've got a remarkable range of breeding birds.
Have a look at this, David.
What have you found, Fred?
We're found in the top of this azalea here.
Well, who'd have guessed it now? Look at it.
More in.
There are about 20 different species that breed here alone in these under 40 acres. And that's not just one nest each. There are several nests, naturally lots of them. But 20 is a considerable number to breed here year after year in this relatively small area.
Here's a recent arrival, the long-tailed tit, building a lovely domed nest. You'll get a change in the species here from year to year. Most summers, this little insect eater, the spotted flycatcher, nests in the garden. It's a migrant from Africa. Now, what you'll notice straight away is how well the birds do here. What a variety there is. The flamingos are imported, of course, but on the lake, you've got several kinds of wild duck. Mallard, pochard, and tufted duck, as well as Canada geese. But why are the birds so successful? It's obvious, really. They can fly. It's much harder for other animals. How would they cross the raging torrent of the traffic? There's really only one furry animal which does, using the branches of the plane trees as a bridge from Green Park. But the grey squirrel is alone. The Queen has no wood mice like those in my summer house.
We did once see one vole. That was a famous occasion. I was with Peter Crowcroft. We were coming from different directions, and we both exclaimed at the same moment, "Goodness, there's a vole." We never saw it again, never seen it before or since. There was once a frog found in here, and it had a great red belly on, and it was looked on as frightfully exciting, and all sorts of photos were taken. But that was only one frog. How it got in, we can't think, and it didn't last long either. We've never found a toad, anything like that.
So while there are many more birds here than in my garden, there is less of other kinds of wildlife. It's the isolation of Buckingham Palace Garden from other areas with a range of wildlife which limits what can get here. Buckingham Palace Garden is a small island, a long way from any rural area. But there are other much larger and less isolated green islands in the capital. Here we are in Richmond Park, 2,500 acres of oak woodland and rough ground with herds of red deer. Here you've got birds like jackdaws and cackling green woodpeckers that you won't find in central London. And in fact, there's an amazing variety of creatures for a city island. But the main reason for my visit here with gamekeeper David Smith was to compare two familiar animals. Now, the red fox is one of these. It is, of course, very successful in town. The badger is the other. There are lots of them here, but they haven't colonized the city as the fox has. Now let's take a look at the badger's lifestyle. Here he is dragging bedding down into his set. Badgers are social animals, living in groups in a maze of underground tunnels. They do a fair bit of scavenging, but their main food is earthworms. So what does the old badger need to survive? Well, firstly, the kind of ground in which he can dig. In this case, you can see it very clearly there. Look at it. It's sand. And if you've got sand, then you can dig in it very easily. And so, where there's plenty of sand, there will be badgers. If, for instance, you were to say, well, Buckingham Palace Gardens has got lots of sand in it, why can't it go and dig there? Just look at the badger. Great animal, short, stocky, stumpy-legged. The good old badger, he's great at crawling under little holes in fences, as we've seen all the way around here. But climbing over a fence, no. Jumping over things, no. That really isn't the badger's way of life. He stalks along, and he's a really rough old chap. The fox is a much more agile animal, and I'm sure that that is the major reason, not simply the lack of habitat, but a badger just would never have got right into the middle of the city. And this is why we have the badger coming as far as Richmond, and he sits on the top of the hill there, looking down towards the city, and as the foxes move past on their way to London, he looks at them and he says, "You must be crazy." Of course, the cunning old fox isn't crazy, but it does have a very different lifestyle from the badger. The fox can easily jump suburban fences, so it's no problem for it to get into town. So that's one big advantage the fox has over the badger. It's more agile. Another is that the fox has a much more varied diet. It eats fruit, birds, and a great range of scavenged food as well. Lastly, compared with the badger, the fox is a loner, digging its solitary hole or earth under garden sheds with no need of a maze of burrows. It's for all these reasons that the fox has been so successful at living in towns, even the centre of London. Look at this. We've even got a fox's earth hidden away by the Serpentine restaurant in Hyde Park. You'll find plenty of food there, I should think. Now, you'll hear people say that the fox has adapted to town life, as if it had undergone some radical evolutionary change. But I don't see that it's much different from the country fox. The point is, the town suits it, but it doesn't suit the badger. It's not only the badger that is confined in London to the outskirts of town. So too, it seems, is this really quite comical bird, the jackdaw. Now, there used to be jackdaws in Kensington Gardens, but they've gone from there. A clue to why this is might be this scene here in Richmond Park. The jackdaws pull fur from the red deer for nesting material, a material that they couldn't find in the central parks. Maybe the jackdaw is limited to places where it can find deer or sheep. It might even need open country for some of its food as well. The jackdaw is certainly happy in small towns not far from the country. Here by the embankment, you won't see jackdaws or rooks. The last rookery went from this spot in 1916. But you will see this bird, the carrion crow. Just about every London square now has its pair of crows, nesting high up in the plane trees. They raise 5 or 6 young early in the year, before the leaves are out on the trees. Now, the crow belongs to the same family as the jackdaw and the rook. So why should it be successful here and not those other birds? I suspect it's to do with food. The crow eats small birds and scraps of meat, and it finds plenty of these in London, which enables it to raise its young. So the crow is very successful in London, but the jackdaw isn't. Now, of course, that could have something to do with London's enormous size, which means that its central green islands are literally miles from any real countryside, which of course limits the range of the species that can get there. In much smaller towns, like Oxford, you'll see jackdaws and rooks, as we've got here, nesting right in the centre of town, but of course flying to the country for their food. Rooks are quite happy to nest in towns if they can feed on farmland nearby. The same is true of jackdaws, which nest in Oxford's chimney pots. So the size of the town will affect what can get there. But so, of course, will the region the town's in, because that's, in fact, what determines who's out there waiting, who's ready to come and colonize the town from the surrounding countryside. Now, there's no wilder scene than this sunrise over Marsden Rock in the North Sea. The rock is a breeding ground for many seabirds, cormorants and gulls, and it's difficult to imagine any of them moving into our towns. But industrial Tyneside is not so far away. Here in the bustling centre of the city, you've got nesting one of those birds from Marsden Rock. It's the kittiwake, which you won't find in London or Oxford. This old warehouse in Gateshead has in recent years become an artificial cliff for these birds. They nest on the narrowest of ledges high above the town. Now, the warehouse isn't so very different from Marsden Rock, and kittiwakes which nest in the town can fly out to sea for their food. In fact, the town birds behave in exactly the same way as those that nest on the rock. You can't really say that the kittiwakes have altered their behaviour in order to colonise the town. They've succeeded here because they can commute between their artificial cliffs and their feeding grounds. Whatever kind of wildlife we're talking about, whether or not we're actually going to find a particular species in the town will depend on a whole series of really very complicated factors, but the basic principle will always remain the same. Now, in this pond in my garden, I've got frogs, but I haven't got any toads. Now, I'm not really quite sure why it suits the frogs and not the toads, but I think it's reasonable to presume that this is due to really quite small differences in their life cycles. It certainly isn't because the frog has obtained some amazing new adaptation to fit it in the town that the toad can't manage. Here's the old toad emerging from its winter hibernation hole in February. Now, this is a time of great sexual frenzy for these creatures, and they're all making for a breeding pond. Toads have quite large territories, maybe 2 miles from the pond, and may have a long way to travel. In towns, this means crossing roads, which, as we know, can be pretty hazardous. Males often waylay females en route to the pond and, locked in the mating embrace, get a lift there. Now, toads are very fussy about the ponds they breed in, for reasons we don't really understand, and hundreds head for the same spot. Here are the frogs behaving in much the same way. But there are critical differences which make things easier for the frogs. They hibernate in or near their breeding pond and don't have so far to travel. And again, we don't know why. They are less fussy about the ponds they use. The frog, much more than the toad, is happy in suburban garden ponds, and perhaps that's why it does better in town. It's a classic tale of two very similar creatures, one doing well and the other struggling in the strange landscape of the city.
His community unit, in association with Zanussi, has produced a free wildlife pack to help you with your own city safari. It has colourful descriptions of over 50 animals and plants found in cities, as well as information about wildlife organisations. For your copy of the pack, write to City Safari, Box 33, London SE1 9LT. That's City Safari, Box 33, London SE1 9LT.